Hi, in this quick video clip, we are going to cover the topic of economic scarring and the long-term growth. Particularly in terms of long-term growth, I am referring back to the notions in the economics book of Sloman. And yes, I would like as well to refer about the economic scarring coming from the short-term events. So sometimes economic recessions are portrayed as short-term effects or events. But there is a substantial economic literature that shows the consequences of high unemployment, falling incomes, and reduced economic activity. So, for example, a job loss and falling incomes can force and families and societies to delay or forego college education for children. So frozen credit markets and depressed consumer spending can stop the creation of otherwise vibrant small businesses. So I think we have seen that during the pandemic time. So larger companies may delay as well or reduce the spending in research and development. So in all these cases, economic recession can lead to scarring, that is long-lasting damage to individuals' economic situations and the economy as a whole. So, um, what the literature says about this economic scarring? So, for instance, we know that economic scarring can be seen in educational achievement. Just to mention one example, so unemployment and income losses reduce the educational achievement and progress by threatening early children nutrition, for instance, reducing families' abilities to provide a supportive learning environment for the households or the children and the young people in the economy. So this create a situation in which we are forced to delay or abandon college plans, for instance, for young people or university plans. I think that happened a lot during these last 2 years of pandemic. Another issue is, for instance, opportunities. So when we have these recessions, um, jobs and income losses can have lasting effects and consequences on individuals and families. I think most families have experienced the hardship coming from this crisis of the pandemic. So the increasing poverty that will occur as a result of a recession will have lasting consequences for children and will impose lasting costs for the economy. Another example of this scarring is the private investment. When we have recessions, we can pass or we can have decreases in investment, such as the one we have in the financial crisis of 2007. More or less 20% of a decrease we had during through the second quarter of 2009. So the decrease in investment leads to a production capacity that is not there anymore. So and they probably will not be for years to come. I believe that this last point has been during the pandemic, we have like differentiated effects, like having, for instance, the technological sector picking up during the pandemic after the support of the Federal Reserve and the government expansion, the expansion of the governments, the expenditure that we experience to help the economy for like a very bad recession. Finally, another example for economic scarring can be, for instance, entrepreneurial activity, business formation. New and small businesses are often they receive often the harder hit from the recessions, and often they are at the front of technological advances as well. So they for them to invest in technology is more difficult. So with credit crunch and the reduction in consumer demand, small businesses are seeing like a double squeeze. So, and there is also substantial evidence that economic outcomes are passed across generations, not just like one generation. Let's say that we are talking about 10 years. So, economic hardships for parents mean that there are going to be more economic hurdles for children. Um, So deficits can cause transfers of wealth from future generations. So the current deficit that we are experiencing, that we hope that we are going to sort out in 2024, it looks like if there is not a change in the regime or in the government because of the political problems that we are always like experiencing in the UK. So yes, I believe that um, deficits can cause these transfers of wealth from future generations or taxpayers to the present. So in expending this much and printing this much money, I think we are passing the bill to future generations. So these costs must be also be like compared with the economic consequences of recessions that are also passed to future generations. Okay, guys, so I think these are the examples of economic scarring, and let's go to our slides to go over the notions and concepts that we have for this lecture. So we start here. Yes. And we have here the chapter, which is long run economic growth in industrialized countries. So, first of all, the twin characteristics of economic growth. So, some facts. The first fact is that economies are volatile in nature. So, even though when we have this volatile performance in terms of growth, we do not have like we have crashes and we have a business cycle. So the long-term economic growth actually look more steady. There is a trend increasing. So here we have the example of that. We have in blue the economic growth year by year since 1850 for the UK. And you can see how there are many fluctuations in economic growth. However, if we look at the graph that is here in red, you can see how actually the long-term growth is more steady. So you can bet that in the long run, the economy is going to grow. And I think the message from this graph is clear. If people is suffering hardship, they need to understand that in the very long run we are going to have economic growth. So I think that this pandemic will pass. Problems if we have a war, we have had wars in the past. Well, this time is a bit different because it can be the last war, right? There are too many nuclear weapons at the moment, but yes, I believe that in general we can say that economic growth is always increasing and increasing, and that has happened since the 1850. We can bring here into discussion the problem of global warming, but since technology is increasing and um, we are able to find new technologies and new ways to create energy, um, I believe that yes, it's possible that if we have a downturn because of climate change, I think we will quickly come back to the um, growth, right? And I think that is what at least these GS of information that we have in this graph is showing. The different view will be the Malthusian view, the view in which resources are finite, and that means that we will have hardships in the future because countries will tend to get hold of the natural resources, and that can cause obviously problems. Okay, so another issue is illustrating the rising potential output in the dynamic aggregate demand, dynamic aggregate supply, and ISMP models. Remember that the ISMP model is the equilibriums in the good market and the equilibriums in the money market. So here we have on this slide the long-term growth in integrated dynamic aggregate demand and dynamic aggregate supply. And in the right panel, in the panel B, we have here the ISMP framework that we covered before. So here in this slide, you can see how in the y-axis, in the panel A, we have actually we have inflation. Yes, in the y-axis we have inflation in the panel A, and a pi asterisk is the level of inflation in the equilibrium. Particularly, we believe that in the long run, or we can depart from this equilibrium, yes, in which the economy have a potential of growth. We believe that we have a potential because the economy has certain level of capital, of assets to produce. So very difficult to produce beyond that without causing inflation. Yes. So if the economy is in equilibrium and is growing at the potential growth, so therefore we are going to be in a situation in which dynamic aggregate supply and dynamic aggregate demand will be in equilibrium as well at the optimum level of inflation. We can say as well that that optimum level of inflation might be the targeting or the inflation that has been targeted because we are in the dynamic aggregate demand, dynamic aggregate supply framework. And in the B panel, so as the economy is as well in the potential, we can see how as well in the long run the MB curve that is going to represent the money market, and the IS investment and savings that represents the goods market are going to give us an interest rate of equilibrium R asterisk. So, as you can see here, the economy is in equilibrium, and we can see the actual equilibrium in both graphs. So, let's imagine that we have a rise in the potential real national income from YP1 to YP2. So how can this happen? Well, by investment in the capacity of the economy to produce more. So for an increment in capital, say that if we create robots to farm, or if we increase the capacity to communicate stuff, or to or we create better computers or better roads to communicate towns, etc. Yes, so in doing that, we are going to increase the capacity of the economy to grow. So, but what could happen then with the level of equilibrium? In this case, a rise in the potential outcome in over the long term, um, the rise in the potential real income shifts to the right, and the dynamic aggregate supply, the dynamic aggregate demand, and the dynamic aggregate supply curves shifts as well to the right, together with the IS and MP curves. In general, sometimes it's usual to find in economics that positive shocks make the lines to shift to the right. This is the case this time, and the rationale is like well, a little bit evident. If we have like more potential, so therefore we can offer or demand, aggregate demand can increase further as we are building up things, and at the same time aggregate supply can provide more goods at a better price, yes, or at the same level of prices that is in inflation, and that will make the new equilibrium point to rise to a situation in which we have a stable inflation, yes, and also a situation in which we have a new equilibrium point in both curves. So we pass from this equilibrium A to this equilibrium point B, and in the right hand panel money will increase to the right, and as well in the goods market is going to produce more, so we have a shift as well here in the IS curve as well. And if this does happen, imagine that we have a situation in which we increase in the short run, we increase the capacity of the economy to produce the potential growth, and therefore there is like a shift to the right, but not yet close to the points B that we have here on these new equilibriums. In that case, the government will need to apply uh, like an expansionary policy, government or the central bank, in order to increase demand, and in doing that, shifting the curve to the potential level of the economy, which is obviously one of the mechanisms, and one of the situations that both governments and central bankers want to have in the economy. They want to have a steady growth, and that is what is going to happen if in the case in which growth do not is not in the potential. So authorities will try to perform policies to increase demand, and try to shift the equilibrium point to the potential of the economy, in this case YP2. So economic capacity increases in general, but may be reduced following a crisis such as the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, so let's see the growth over the decades. So we have here in this graph the long-term output growth in real GDP. Real GDP means that is GDP growth, gross domestic product, minus inflation. So we are taking the inflation out because it's like a distortion of the real growth. And we have here six countries: the UK, France, the United States, Japan, Australia, and Ireland. Here we have first the UK. This is the growth for the UK, so you can see the long-term output growth, and the index is based on the 1960 level for all these countries. Yes, and this is France. This is the USA, and you can see actually here we have Japan with very, very high long-term growth in the 90s, when we thought that they were going to be the first world in growth. Um, beyond the United States, yes, but they have had many decades in which this long run growth has been actually less vertical than in the past. So the slope has decreased. But you can see how actually we have had during all these years since the 60s many economic shocks or downturns. So, for instance, in the 70s, here you can see how all the countries had the break a little bit, but in comparison with the long-term output growth, uh, these shocks, even the pandemic, if you can see the pandemic, you can see the shock here, but is we are already achieving the pre-pandemic levels in some economies. Some economies are beyond the pre-pandemic level. So yes, these shocks actually look like very small in comparison with the long-term economic output growth. Here in this color, like pink color, you can see Australia, and finally a very interesting case, which is the long-term output growth from Ireland. Which brings me to say that probably North Ireland is actually it can fall under the influence of the big long-term output growth from Ireland. Here on this slide we have the average annual percentage growth rates from 1961 to 2021. First of all, we have real GDP, so we are able to compare countries using the real GDP. Again, real GDP is the gross domestic product when we take out the effects of the distortion of inflation. So we take out the distortion of the price levels changing. And you can see how here actually we have very interesting results. So for Ireland, for instance, the real GDP is 4.8%. So a very strong growth in general. And we see as well that the country that has less economic growth is Germany, yes, as a whole, together with the United Kingdom. Um, and this is because these countries, the UK and Germany, are actually at the top in growth, yes, in like absolute terms, not well at the top of GDP in amount, yes, rather than in growth. So I believe that even though when Ireland is growing at 4.8%, is still lagging behind the UK in terms of amount of growth. Yes, but it's for sure is converging towards the UK. And convergence is a very important topic because some countries are looking that are converging towards the more the developed economies. Yes, whereas some countries look like they are staying lagging behind, and they are not able to carry on growing. However, this real GDP is a little bit like not very useful to compare countries since we are not taking into account the people, the inhabitants, the households in the economy. So that is why we have here real GDP per worker and real GDP per capita. These two fundamentals allow for a better comparison among countries. Particularly will be useful as well the real GDP per capita, but in PPT numbers, meaning that we need as well to take out of the these readings of GDP the fact that products or goods have different prices in the world. So, for instance, in my country, a burger will cost something like I believe like let's say something like £5, right? You go to a restaurant, it will cost you £5, whereas uh, you can find the same burger here in the UK, probably the same quality. I would say for something like £8 or something like that, £8 or £10. So as you can see, there are a lot of there is a difference there in terms of prices. That is why we use PPT measures or power purchasing parity changes. We can as well have to look at try to look at these measures at the ONS. So in terms of real GDP, you can see how here in red we have Australia that actually it was growing at 3.4, but in terms of real GDP is only 1.9%. So I think this makes more sense. So after applying real GDP per worker, you can see how actually these readings change a lot. Not as so much for Ireland, because I think this is one of the countries that, yes, is a developed country, but is still converging towards the level of the UK and Germany and France. So, but yes, in terms of real GDP, you can see how other economies that are converging are Spain, Japan. Japan is a developed economy, but it's still growing. I think that the problem that they have had in the past is more about very low inflation. So I think they are very happy at the moment with at least they are having an inflation that they have not been able to have for many years. Finally, here we have real GDP per capita, which is another reading that we can use together with real GDP per worker. And I think the conclusions might be very similar using real GDP per capita. Big different, like some different implications are, for instance, in the case of Canada. So you can see how there is very different the reading per capita when you have per worker, meaning that probably there is more benefits, or there is like more people that actually are benefiting from the growth in the economy, but they are not really a part of that workforce. So it looks like there is a higher number of people that is not at work, not looking for jobs in Canada, as real GDP per worker is higher than the real GDP per capita. So the picture is very similar when we use both readings, I was saying, and yes, other probably big difference here is the case of New Zealand passing from 1.5% to 1.1%, and the United States passing from 2% to 1.6%. It's very similar to the reading that we have for Canada, actually. Yes. Right, so this is the average annual growth rates between 1993 and 2021. I think average annual growth rates are very important because it can give us an idea of what is the capacity of all these economies to grow. What is the potential growth of these economies? So here we have in this column the real GDP. As I said before, real GDP we need to actually to compare, we need to use real GDP per capita. Real GDP is useful to compare like the size of the country, right? And in both readings anyway, China, you can see that like the average growth rate of China has been 8.4%. It's a very high growth. That is the problem at this very moment because they are projecting to have only 4% of growth. And China is particularly very important for developing countries since China is trying to move from a manufacturing based economy to a more consumption based economy. So they are trying to enact like policies such as the common prosperity policy that actually have hit very hard the stock market in there. And yes, I think it has been very difficult to make businesses in China in the last months. Particularly, they have a real estate crisis as well that has been threatening that economy. So they have only 4%, so they are growing well below their capacity. Yes, so other countries that are very interesting, as you can see from here, are India, Ethiopia, Ireland, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, Nigeria, New Zealand, etc. I think Nigeria not very much as India or China. Is steadily growing, particularly in terms of long run. Um, there is research, I think, that tries to explain why some countries, such as Nigeria and other African countries, do not look to increase in economic growth or converge to the group of economic growth from other worlds. Indeed, I believe that the pandemic and the recessions hit harder poorer economies since capital always flows to richer countries. So, but I think that once we have a more stable situation in terms of growth, I think that would be like a very good opportunity to start investing in developing economies. Is this the moment? Perhaps not yet, right? We need to wait a bit up until we have like less volatile conditions in economics. So the implications of these tables is or are that when comparing growth in different countries, we have a convergence of rich economies. Yes, so they stay together in terms of certain economic growth. And despite this rapid growth, in some developing countries that are converging towards this group of rich economies, we have as well that we have growth in other countries remains still slow, meaning that we have two groups of developing countries, those who are converging, those who are not. So this takes us then to the discussion of what are the causes of economic growth in the long run and why countries are actually poor. I think the topic of why countries or why poor countries are poor is the topic that we are going to cover in our live session. But indeed, we have an increase in the quantity of factors as the main driver of economic growth. So these drivers, factors of long-run economic growth are capital and labor. And well, theory includes there sometimes within the model technology, sometimes outside of the model. But we can say that mainly we can think of capital and labor as the main. Sometimes they add land, yes, as another different resource, but yes, typically models start only with capital and labor, and then they carry on expanding towards economic growth, population growth, and they probably they go towards technology, and they will carry on increasing the number of variables thereafter. So here we have, in terms of capital, which is one of the factors, the UK net capital stock from the UK. I think this is interesting to see because we are able to get to know whether in this graph 2018, I think that is the most recent one is from the release of November 2021. However, this slide that you are seeing here needs to be built together with the data from the ONS, the capital stocks consumption and fixed capital report, and the quarterly national account series from the ONS. So I think that will take like a long time. So we have here as an example 2018, which is as well recent. And first of all, you can see here the type of UK net capital stock. Capital would like to say that are not intermediate goods. It cannot be that, and it cannot be as well a financial asset either. Yes, so that would be the only commentary that I would like to say about capital. So very important for us is to get to know what is the capital intensity in countries, and that is what this slide is telling us here. Well, the next slide will explain more about capital intensity, really. But this one is telling us about net capital stock. So we have that dwelling, excluding lands, is 1.7 trillions. Yes, other buildings and structures are 1.3 trillions. Land improvements, 186 billion. We have ICT and other machinery and equipment, 532. And it's very important to see actually what is the percentage of fixed assets to get to know what are the main capital stock for the United Kingdom. And you can see how actually dwellings, excluding land, is particularly something or like a portion of the economy that is very important for us to accumulate capital. And I think that is the reason why the government tries to protect as much as it can the construction sector and the prices of. They do not like when prices go down in terms of real estate because that will hurt badly the economy as the percentage of UK net capital stock, you can see here that is 41% of the whole economy, and as a percentage of the GDP is 81.7%. Right? So we have here a percentage of fixed assets. Yes. So dwellings and other buildings and structures is accounts for 73% of all fixed assets. And we can see here as well that other buildings and structures have 32%. So two very important readings. So very interesting is to compare this 2018 with the average real annual change because we want to get to know at what is the capital increment, because in general, I would say that the most important issue then for us to get to know if we are going to have like a beta long run growth is that percentage change of capital, at what extent our economy is increasing the capital and reinvesting some utilities in some assets that are going to allow the economy to expand more and to carry on hiring people and growing. And that for the United Kingdom, of the average real annual change is between 1996 and 2018 is 1%. And from 2009 from 2018, look after the global economic, global financial crisis is 0%, which is something that is a bit concerning, since as you can see here, dwelling excluding lands is actually a very important portion of the economy. Indeed, we still can have like that growth in making more dwellings, yes. Yes, but what this is looking, what this is showing is that actually we are just replacing the dwellings of the depreciation of the dwellings that we have year after year in 20 after 2009 from 2018. So I think this is very important because it allows us to see that we need to increase this capital investment in terms of dwellings just in order to like improve the way in which we increase like the productivity and as well the growth in our economy. So very interestingly, see here, so you can compare the average of 1996 to 2018 and what happened in the period post the great financial crisis. It's going to be very fascinating to get to know what are these average real annual change after the pandemic, particularly because we have a problem in the UK. The issue is called the productivity puzzle, meaning that the capital divided by labor is actually growing very slowly or at levels that are not very good for an economy. Yes, so we need productivity actually to increase more. And that is another cause of economic growth. I was talking about the productivity. We measure productivity by using GDP divided by labor. Yes, GDP per worker. And we also use capital per worker or capital per capita. But I think capital per worker will make more sense sometimes. So in this slide, we have the growth in capital and output per worker. So between the 60s and 2021, in the y-axis, we have the increase in output per worker, yes, and in the x-axis, we have the increase in capital stock per worker. So we have here a GDP per worker and K or capital per worker. And these are the results. So you can see how the UK is together with the Netherlands, Denmark, the United States, Switzerland, and I think this it looks like a very advanced economies are converging in this zone. Belgium is actually like in the midway between other countries, yes. But France, which is like a very similar economy to the UK, is actually its levels of capital stock per worker are higher, so they are actually transforming or investing more in their economy than and but in general the GDP per capita has not had like the result that you would expect if do you have that increase in capital stock per worker. But you can see here a trend more or less among these countries, correct? And since all these countries, or most of these countries are advanced, I will not say that Turkey is advanced. It's a very interesting case because they only have like a very low capital stock per worker, so low capital, relatively in the medium right of this table, but they have a very large growth per worker, which is showing us that actually the productivity in Turkey is very high. It's higher than in other countries. Obviously, this tells us a different story to what we have been hearing in the news about Turkey. And it's the fact that Turkey is a very big economy, of course, but the stock exchange actually is like sending bad signals to the markets. It's actually going down, and the lira is depreciating even more. So yes, so this is why this graph is very important because it allows us to compare what is the capital intensity um, per country. Yes, and that capital intensity is something that we want to grow more. So, for instance, in the case of Ireland, very good, and the case of Turkey as well, very good. Obviously, this data accounts for since the 60s up until 2021. So I'm not saying that actually the current macroeconomic situation of Turkey is the one that we are seeing on this slide. I think we are making a very long average because we are interested actually in the long run. Okay, so productivity is very interesting. We are using as a benchmark for productivity the United Kingdom here in red, in the number 100. You can see the GDP per hour worked. Yes, and you can see actually how we are going or lagging behind uh, economies that we believe that are the ones that we want to compare the country with. So, for instance, Germany and France, or the United States as well, and the Eurozone. So, the Eurozone has actually had less productivity up until 2013, and afterwards, their productivity has grown a little bit higher than the United Kingdom. Being one of the reasons why we have the Brexiters. One of the arguments for Brexit is actually the point that the productivity puzzle might be solved by taking our own actions. In part, I think we blame the Eurozone and the European Union for our problems in productivity. And that is a current controversy. I'm not saying that is false or right. At the moment, we are still researching the problem of productivity puzzle in the United Kingdom. Let's see if the situation improves after this pandemic, since we are having like a boost during the previous year. Obviously, we are looking here at the long run. Yes, so probably what happened the next year is not going to affect that much, but it will give us, this graph is giving us an idea of what is happening in terms of productivity in other countries. So yes, I would say that we are lagging behind. The trends are showing that all the countries are in productivity is better than in the UK. The only case that is not that is the case of Japan, in which productivity has been very low, particularly, I would say, because of the low growth rate of Japan and the problem of deflation, a problem that they have not been able to solve since the 90s. So only now we have a world inflation, they have seen some inflation and they feel happy about it. We have the productivity in selected economies. So in the previous slide, we have it like in comparison to the UK. Here on this slide, you can see what is the same measure, like with a different graph, and you can see how actually France, Germany, and the Eurozone are converging towards the productivity of the United Kingdom. The problem is notorious here that after the crisis of 2007, the productivity has been flat, very close to zero, a growth of zero here after the crisis of 2007 and 8. Finally, we have here the productivity in selected economies. And you can see how the rings change a little bit because we have the GDP per person employed and the GDP per hour worked. So no all countries have the same number of hours to work. That is why we have that Germany has a higher reading for GDP per hour worked, meaning that productivity is higher than the United Kingdom. But that is the fact that the laws in Germany are different in terms of hours that we need to work, or that people need to work in comparison to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, you can see that the productivity is 100, and that is like the benchmark for the others. And you will see Germany, France, the United States with a higher productivity rate, Japan below the United Kingdom, and the Eurozone only slightly better than the UK. Okay, guys, this is the lecture that I covered with you many important concepts, particularly the takeaways from these slides are the convergence of some developing countries towards the growth of more developed countries, the fact that developed countries stop growing at very high rates. The problems of China that is experiencing now, the scarring of the economies and the situation in terms of how these short-run economic events sometimes generate problems in education, achievement, opportunity, private investments, and entrepreneurial activity. That is something that creates a certain scarring in the economy. Okay, guys. So in our next video, I think I will cover the topic of long-run economic growth, uh, and it will be great if you can see uh, the topic of Central African Republic, because I would like to talk or to cover the topic of why poor countries are poor. So see you in my next video.